The year is 1942, and while the U.S. Army is racing to equip every soldier with the new M1 Garand rifle, the Marine Corps is quietly stockpiling a weapon from 1897. The brass calls it obsolete. The Marines about to land on Guadalcanal call it the only thing that'll save their lives when 300 screaming Japanese soldiers come at them in the dark. These trench guns are 45 years old. The design is older than most of the men who'll carry them, and according to every modern military doctrine, they're dangerously obsolete. The Army Ordnance Department has spent a decade pushing modern warfare theory, longer engagement ranges, semi-automatic fire, standardized rifle ammunition. They've run the calculations. The future of combat is 3,500 yards, where the M1's 8-round clip and 3006 cartridge dominate. Shotguns, with their 40-yard effective range and 5-shell capacity, are classified as limited utility weapons suitable only for guard duty and riot control. The military manuals are clear. Trench guns belong in the last war, not this one. But there's a problem with the Army's numbers. They're based on European warfare, open fields, distant tree lines, predictable defensive positions. Nobody in Washington is calculating what happens when combat takes place in triple canopy jungle at midnight, where you can't see 15 feet in front of your foxhole. And nobody's accounting for an enemy whose primary infantry doctrine is the Banzai charge. Massed human wave attacks that close distance faster than most men can reload. The Marines know better. They've been studying Japanese tactics since the Shanghai fighting in 1937. They've read the reports from British forces in Malaysia and Dutch defenders in the East Indies. They know what's coming. When the Imperial Japanese Army commits to a charge, they don't advance in skirmish lines at 300 yards. They mass at 50 yards, fix bayonets, and come in a screaming wave designed to overrun positions through pure shock and numbers. Your semi-automatic rifle's superior range means nothing when 200 men are coming at you faster than you can acquire targets. So while the Army issues directives about modern small arms doctrine, the Marines start quietly requisitioning every Model 1897 trench gun they can find. They pull them from National Guard armories. They contracted Winchester to resume production of a design from 1897. They strip them from shore installations and training depots. And they issue them to one man in every rifle squad with a single instruction. When they charge, you hold the trigger and pump. The Model 1897 has a feature that newer shotguns deliberately removed. It's called slam fire. Hold the trigger down and work the pump, and it fires every time a shell chambers. No need to pull the trigger between shots. 6 shots in under 3 seconds. At close range, each shell sprays 9 .33 caliber buckshot pellets in a spread pattern. That's 54 projectiles in 3 seconds from one weapon. The military efficiency experts call it wasteful. The Marines call it the only math that matters when humans are charging faster than you can count them. The doctrine says it won't work. The 1940 Small Arms Board report specifically critiques shotguns for limited magazine capacity, excessive recoil, and poor penetration beyond 50 yards. The Army's testing shows semi-automatic rifles deliver superior sustained fire rates and better accuracy. On paper, in controlled conditions, at measured ranges, they're right. A trained rifleman with an M1 Garand can engage 8 targets at 200 yards faster than a shotgunner can reload twice. But doctrine is written in peacetime, and it's about to meet reality. August 7, 1942. The 1st Marine Division hits the beaches at Guadalcanal. They're carrying a mix of weapons, the old bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifles, some early M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, and dozens of those obsolete Winchester 1897 trench guns. The landing is almost unopposed. The Japanese construction workers flee into the jungle. The Marines secure Henderson Field by nightfall. It feels almost easy. Then the sun goes down. The Japanese doctrine is simple and terrifying. Toko, shock attack. Wait until the Americans are exhausted, disoriented by darkness, uncertain of their perimeter. Then hit them with everything at once. No suppressing fire, no tactical maneuvering, just mass, speed, and cold steel. Fix bayonets, concentrate forces at a single point, and punch through before they can organize a defense. It's brutally effective against enemies who panic, and it's gotten even better against enemies with slow-firing weapons. August 21st, 1942, 0200 hours, the Battle of Tenaru River. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki leads 800 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment in a direct assault on Marine positions along a narrow sandbar. They come in a compact mass, shoulder to shoulder, moving fast. The Marines hear them before they see them. Hundreds of voices screaming, "Banzai!" in the darkness. Rifle fire erupts. Men fire the M1903s as fast as they can work the bolt. 5 shots, then reload. The Garands do better. 8 shots before the distinctive ping of an empty clip. But reloading takes seconds you don't have when the enemy is crossing 50 yards in under 10 seconds. Then the trench guns open up. Boom, 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 boom. 6 shots, 3 seconds, 1 Marine. The front rank of the charge disintegrates. Not slowed, disintegrates. At 20 yards, a single buckshot shell hits with the force of 9 simultaneous rifle rounds spread across a 6-foot pattern. You don't aim at individuals. You aim at the mass. Each pump sends 54 pellets of lead into a human wave that's packed too tight to miss. The Japanese keep coming. That's the doctrine. Never stop, never retreat. But the math has turned ugly. A Banzai charge works when defenders can't deliver enough fire fast enough. It fails when every second brings 50-plus projectiles into a concentrated space. The Marines with Springfields are fighting desperately, working bolts, trying to thin the charge. The Marines with shotguns are creating gaps in reality, spaces where there were men, and now there's just night air and the sound of buckshot hitting flesh. The charge breaks, not from fear. These men don't retreat, but from mathematics. You can't maintain momentum when the front rank ceases to exist every 3 seconds. The survivors reach the Marine foxholes and brutal hand-to-hand fighting erupts, but the mass is gone, the shock is broken, and the defensive line holds. By dawn, 800 Japanese soldiers are dead or dying on the sandbar. 15 Marines are killed, mostly in the close-quarters melee after the charge fragmented. The after-action reports are clinical. Shotgun-armed personnel demonstrated exceptional effectiveness against massed infantry assault. Recommend increased allocation. But the word spreading through the Corps is simpler. The trench guns stopped them cold. The Army brass reads the reports with skepticism. Guadalcanal was one battle, unusual circumstances, close terrain. The doctrine still favors the M1 Garand for 90% of combat situations, and they're not wrong. But they're not accounting for what's about to happen across dozens of Pacific islands where the jungle is thick, the nights are black, and the Japanese have one tactical answer to American firepower. Get close enough that firepower doesn't matter. Except now the Marines have a weapon that turns close enough into a killing field. And they're about to use it again, and again, and again. The Winchester Model 1897 entered service during the Spanish-American War as a utilitarian tool. Cheap, reliable, devastating at room-clearing range. By World War I, it had found its true calling in the trenches of France. When American doughboys needed to clear German bunkers and traverse trenches where rifle length was a liability, the 1897 became the trench gun. Its 20-inch barrel, bayonet lug, and ventilated heat shield turned it into the most feared close-quarters weapon on the Western Front. So feared, in fact, that on September 19, 1918, the German government filed a formal diplomatic protest. They called the shotgun inhumane and threatened to execute any American soldier captured carrying one. The German complaint cited the unnecessary suffering caused by buckshot wounds and claimed the weapon violated the laws of civilized warfare. The irony was rich. This complaint came from the same military using flamethrowers and poison gas. The U.S. response was blunt. The shotgun stays, and any execution of American prisoners would result in reciprocal action. The Germans backed down, but the protest did something unexpected. It marked the shotgun as somehow excessive, too brutal even for trench warfare. When WWI ended and the military began modernizing for future conflicts, the trench gun carried this stigma. It was effective, yes, but in a dirty, unsophisticated way. The military was moving towards scientific warfare, standardized cartridges, semi-automatic actions. Weapons designed for the open battlefields military theorists expected in the next war. The 1920s and 1930s saw the rise of the modern rifle doctrine. The military wanted weapons that could engage at 3,500 yards, could sustain fire without constant reloading, and fit into a standardized logistics chain. The shotgun failed every test. Its effective range was under 50 yards. Its ammunition was non-standard and bulky. Its 5-shell capacity seemed pathetic compared to the 8-round M1 Garand being developed. The 1935 Small Arms Review Board was decisive. Shotguns were specialty weapons suitable for military police and guard duty, but had no place in frontline infantry combat. The Army began phasing them out. Thousands of Model 1897s went into storage or were transferred to National Guard units for riot control. The few that remained in active service were relegated to base security. By 1941, when America entered World War II, official doctrine barely mentioned shotguns except as a footnote. The future belonged to the Garand, the BAR, and eventually the fully automatic weapons that would define modern warfare. But the Marine Corps never fully bought in. Marines had institutional memory of Pacific operations in the 1920s. Haiti, Nicaragua, the Philippines. They remembered jungle fighting where engagement distances were measured in feet, not football fields. They'd seen combat in Shanghai in 1937 and heard stories from British and Dutch forces about Japanese tactics. When the Corps started planning for Pacific operations in 1941, some officers started asking uncomfortable questions about what happens when doctrine meets jungle darkness and an enemy that deliberately closes to bayonet range. Those questions led to quiet requisitions. Nothing official, nothing that would raise flags with Army ordnance, just requests for additional security weapons and jungle warfare equipment trials. By early 1942, the Marines were pulling Model 1897s out of storage and issuing them to combat units heading west. The official paperwork called them supplementary arms. The Marines packing them into their gear called them insurance against something the manuals didn't account for. They had no idea how right they were. The U.S. Army's infantry doctrine in 1941 was a masterpiece of rational design built on a foundation that didn't exist in the Pacific. The FM 235 Field Manual, U.S. Rifle, Caliber 30, M1, outlined the future of infantry combat with mathematical precision. Engagement ranges, 2,500 yards. Rate of fire, 40,050 aimed shots per minute. Ammunition, standardized, 3006 cartridge, compatible with rifles, machine guns, and support weapons. It was logistics, ballistics, and tactical theory all aligned into one elegant system. The doctrine assumed something fundamental. You'd see the enemy before they got close. Combat would happen at distances where superior American marksmanship and firepower could thin enemy formations before they reached your position. Even in the worst case, a determined enemy assault, you'd have time. Time to aim. Time to reload. Time to coordinate defensive fire. The math worked beautifully on paper and on the open training ranges where doctrine was tested. Then the terrain stopped cooperating. The Pacific Islands weren't the plains of Europe, or even the theoretical battlefields of military textbooks. Guadalcanal's jungle was a claustrophobic nightmare of triple canopy rainforest, where visibility dropped to 10–15 feet. Tarawa would be a flat coral atoll where the only cover was what you dug yourself. Peleliu's ridges would offer 1,000 hiding spots within stone-throwing distance of American positions. And all of it would happen in conditions the doctrine barely mentioned: night combat. The Japanese had spent the 1930s developing tactics specifically designed to nullify American firepower advantages. They'd studied U.S. doctrine, and they'd found its weakness. American weapons were optimized for medium-range engagement. American training emphasized aimed fire and fire discipline. American defensive tactics assumed you'd detect threats early and attrite them at distance. So Japanese doctrine became simple: eliminate the distance. The Toko tactics, shock attack, weren't reckless bravery or fanatical disregard for life, though that's how American propaganda would later paint them. They were calculated mathematics. Japanese planners knew they couldn't win firefights at 300 yards against troops with semi-automatic rifles and machine guns. But at 30 yards? At 10 yards? With bayonets? The firepower advantage disappeared. A bolt-action rifle and a semi-automatic rifle both become clubs when there's a bayonet in your chest. The Banzai charge was the ultimate expression of this doctrine. Concentrate forces, choose darkness or weather to mask the approach, then cover the final distance so fast that American firepower can't deliver enough bullets to stop the mass. It worked terrifyingly well in China. It worked against British forces in Malaysia. It would work, Japanese commanders believed, against the Americans. But there was a variable the Japanese didn't account for, because it didn't exist in American doctrine. The U.S. The Army had indeed abandoned close-range, high-volume firepower weapons. The Army didn't issue shotguns to frontline infantry. The Army's doctrine had no answer for massed charges at 20 yards except maintain fire discipline and hold your position. Advice that sounded confident right up until 300 screaming soldiers materialized out of the darkness. The Marines, though, had never fully committed to that doctrine. The Corps was smaller, more flexible, and had a stubborn institutional streak that came from being the bastard stepchild of the U.S. military. When Marine officers read the Banzai charge reports from China and Malaysia, they didn't see fanaticism. They saw a tactic that would absolutely work against troops armed exclusively with rifles, no matter how modern those rifles were. So while the Army doubled down on the M1 Garand as the answer to every infantry question, the Marines started thinking about what weapon actually answers the question. What stops 200 men crossing 50 yards in 15 seconds? The M1 could put 8 rounds downrange. A machine gun could deliver more, if you had time to traverse and didn't overheat. But a pump shotgun with slam fire could put 54 buckshot pellets into a human wave in under 3 seconds. And you could do it again, and again, as fast as you could feed shells into the tube. The doctrine said it was obsolete thinking. The Marines heading to Guadalcanal thought it might be the only thing that would save their lives. To understand why the shotgun became essential, you need to understand what the Marines were facing. The Banzai charge wasn't random violence, it was a doctrine refined through years of combat, with specific triggers, formations, and objectives. The Imperial Japanese Army had transformed a cultural concept of honor into a tactical system designed to break enemy morale and defensive lines simultaneously. The word Banzai literally means 10,000 years, a traditional exclamation of loyalty to the emperor. But in the military context, It signified something darker: the willingness to trade life for objective. Japanese infantry training emphasized that death in service was not a tragedy, but an honor, and that a soldier's worth was measured in willingness to close with the enemy. This wasn't irrational fanaticism. It was systematic psychological conditioning combined with tactical necessity. Japanese military planners in the 1930s faced a problem: American industrial capacity. They couldn't match U.S. firepower, armor, or artillery, but they could match spirit, speed, and surprise. If Japanese soldiers could close distance before American firepower could stop them, bayonets equalized everything. A .050 Sounds bayonet kills just as effectively as a $200 rifle. The math was brutal but simple. Sacrifice the distance-crossing troops to get the survivors into close combat, where Japanese training in hand-to-hand fighting would dominate. The Banzai charge doctrine had specific parameters. First, timing. Night attacks were preferred when American visibility and coordination degraded. Second, concentration. Mass forces at a single point rather than spread across the line. Third, speed. The final assault had to cover ground faster than defenders could reload and reacquire targets. Fourth, psychology. Noise, aggression, and relentless forward movement would trigger panic in defenders who'd break and run rather than stand and die. It worked horrifyingly well in China. At the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, Japanese night charges repeatedly overran Chinese defensive positions despite heavy initial casualties. The psychological impact was devastating. Chinese troops with superior numbers would abandon positions rather than face the onslaught. In Malaysia, in 1941–42, British and Commonwealth forces with modern weapons were repeatedly broken by night attacks where Japanese troops infiltrated close before launching the final rush. The tactics evolved with experience. Japanese commanders learned to use terrain to mask approach: gullies, riverbeds, jungle undergrowth, getting within 50 yards of American positions before revelation. They learned to coordinate with limited artillery or mortar fire, not to destroy positions, but to force defenders down during the approach. They learned to target weak points, gaps between units, junctions between different companies, positions held by green troops. The final charge itself was choreographed. Officers led from the front, swords drawn, not as practical weapons, but as rallying points and symbols. Soldiers fixed bayonets and maintained tight formations, creating a human mass that looked unstoppable in darkness. The screaming served dual purposes: coordination in the dark and psychological warfare. The goal was to create a wave of bodies and steel that would smash through any defensive line through pure momentum and shock. For defenders, the experience was nightmarish. You'd hear them before you saw them. Hundreds of voices, growing louder, direction unclear in the darkness. Then shapes in the darkness, moving fast. You'd fire, work your bolt, fire again. Maybe you'd hit 1, 2, 3 attackers. But there were dozens more, and they were already at 30 yards, 20 yards, too close to miss, too many to stop. The instinct to run would overwhelm training, and once the line broke, the position was lost. The Japanese knew the tactic had a fatal flaw. If the line held, if defenders didn't break, the casualties would be catastrophic. Troops committed to a Banzai charge couldn't retreat. Doctrine and honor forbade it. They'd fight until death. But that was acceptable math if the tactic worked 70% of the time. 7 successful charges out of 10 meant 7 positions overrun, 7 defensive lines broken. The 30% failure rate was factored in. What the Japanese didn't factor in was a weapon that could deliver close-range, high-volume fire fast enough to stop the charge's momentum before it reached the line. Rifles, even semi-automatic rifles, couldn't deliver enough fire fast enough. Machine guns could, but were priority targets and could be suppressed. but a pump shotgun that could dump 6 rounds in 3 seconds, reload in 6 seconds, and do it again. That wasn't in the calculation. The Marines were about to introduce a variable that would break the math entirely. August 7, 1942. The 1st Marine Division hit the beaches at Guadalcanal, expecting heavy resistance. They got almost none. The Japanese construction workers and small garrison fled into the jungle, leaving behind half-eaten meals and intact equipment. By nightfall, the Marines had secured Henderson Field, the airstrip that was the whole reason for the invasion. It felt too easy. It was. The Japanese command was stunned by the landing. Guadalcanal was supposed to be a backwater construction project, not a battleground. But the island's airfield threatened the entire Japanese defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. Within hours, orders went out. Retake Guadalcanal immediately. The first response was the 28th Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, 917 elite troops who'd fought in China and trained specifically for rapid assault operations. Ichiki was confident and arrogant. He'd studied American forces in the Philippines and knew they'd folded quickly under determined attack. The Marines might be tougher, but they were also strung out, undersupplied, and stuck on a beach with jungle at their backs. His plan was textbook. Night attack, concentrated force, punch through the American perimeter before they could organize a cohesive defense. He didn't even wait for the rest of his regiment. On August 21st, with only 800 men landed, he attacked. The target was the Tanaru River, actually a tidal creek with a narrow sandbar crossing. Marine positions on the east bank were held by the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. They'd spent 2 weeks digging in, laying barbed wire, and preparing fields of fire. But the preparations were based on daylight assumptions. At night, visibility dropped to whatever the moon and starlight provided. The Marines were exhausted, hungry, and jumpy. They'd been hearing reports of Japanese patrols probing the perimeter. Nobody was sleeping well. At 0200 hours, the jungle erupted. Hundreds of voices screaming "Banzai" in the darkness. The Japanese came across the sandbar in a dense mass, shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed. The Marine perimeter exploded with gunfire. Rifle fire cracked from foxholes. Machine guns opened up, tracers cutting red lines through the darkness. The Japanese charge staggered under the initial volley, but didn't stop. Men fell, and the ranks behind them kept coming. This was the moment the doctrine was supposed to work. Marines with M1903 Springfield rifles worked their bolts as fast as training allowed. Fire, bolt, eject, chamber, fire. 5 rounds, then reload. The men with Garands had it better. 8 shots before the empty clip pinged out. But reloading took seconds, and the Japanese were covering ground at a dead sprint. The front rank was hit, but the mass behind them was still coming. 25 yards. 20 yards. Close enough to see faces in the muzzle flash. Then the trench guns opened up. 6 Marines per platoon, stationed between rifle positions, each carrying a Winchester 1897 and bandoliers of 12-gauge buckshot. They'd been told to wait until the enemy was close. They were close. The Marines held triggers down and pumped. Boom, 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 boom. Each shotgun dumping 6 rounds in 3 seconds. Each round sends 9 .33 caliber pellets into the packed mass of the charge. The effect was apocalyptic. At 20 yards, the buckshot spread was tight enough to be deadly, wide enough to hit multiple targets. The front rank of the Japanese charge didn't just fall, it came apart. Bodies jerked and collapsed. The momentum faltered. The men behind stumbled over the fallen, lost cohesion. The Marines pumped fresh shells in and fired again and again. The math had inverted. Instead of not enough bullets to stop the charge, there were too many bullets for the charge to survive. The Japanese didn't retreat. That wasn't in their doctrine. They kept coming, but now as individuals rather than a wave. Some reached the barbed wire. A few made it to the foxholes. Brutal hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Bayonets, entrenching tools, knives, fists. But the mass was broken. The shock was gone. The Marines held. By dawn, the sandbar was a slaughterhouse. 800 Japanese soldiers were dead. 15 Marines killed, mostly in the close quarters fighting after the charge fragmented. Colonel Ichiki, horrified by the failure, burned his regimental colors and shot himself. The battle was over, but the lesson was just beginning. The after-action reports noted extraordinary effectiveness of shotgun-armed personnel against massed assault. But nobody in higher command paid much attention. Guadalcanal was chaotic. One battle meant nothing in the larger picture, except to the Marines who'd been there. They'd seen what happened when the Banzai charge met the trench gun, and they started requesting more. The Winchester Model 1897's effectiveness wasn't magic. It was mathematics that nobody had bothered to calculate for this specific scenario. The weapon had three characteristics that, combined, created a perfect counter to massed infantry charges. First, slam-fire capability. Second, buckshot spread pattern. Third, psychological impact at close range. Together, they turned close-quarters combat math upside down. Slam-fire was almost an accident of design. The Model 1897's trigger mechanism lacked a disconnect. If you held the trigger down and pumped the action, it would fire the moment a shell chambered. Modern shotguns removed this feature deliberately. It wasted ammunition and was unsafe. But in combat, it meant a trained Marine could deliver 6 shots in under 3 seconds without releasing the trigger. No reset, no ream, just pump and shoot. The speed was inhuman, mechanical, relentless. The buckshot payload was the second factor. Standard military buckshot carried 9 pellets of .33 caliber lead, each roughly equivalent to a .32 pistol round. At 20 yards, the spread was approximately 6 feet in diameter, tight enough for devastating effect, wide enough that aiming became approximate. You didn't aim at a specific target. You aimed at the mass. In a packed Banzai charge, missing was almost impossible. Every trigger pull sent 9 projectiles into human flesh. Do the math. 6 shells, 9 pellets each, equals 54 projectiles in 3 seconds from one weapon. Compare that to a bolt-action rifle. 5 shots in maybe 10 seconds if you're fast, then a reload that takes another 5 seconds. Or the M1 Garand, 8 shots in maybe 6 seconds. Then a reload taking 3-4 seconds. The Garand was modern and superior in almost every metric, except this one. When the enemy was at 20 yards and coming fast, the 1897 delivered 9 times more projectiles per second. But raw numbers don't explain the whole effect. There's a psychological component to facing a shotgun at close range. A rifle bullet kills with precision. 1 projectile, 1 wound channel. You might not even see the man next to you get shot. But buckshot doesn't work that way. At close range, multiple pellets hit the same target. The hydrostatic shock and tissue damage are catastrophic. Men don't just fall, they're blown backward. The visual impact on the surrounding troops is immediate and horrifying. For a Banzai charge to work, it needs momentum. The men in back have to keep pushing forward even as the front ranks fall. That requires a kind of psychological commitment that training and culture can instill, but only up to a point. When the man beside you takes a rifle round and falls, you can process that as the fortune of war and keep moving. When the 3 men in front of you simultaneously disintegrate in a spray of buckshot, the hindbrain screams danger in a way training can't fully override. The Japanese tactical manuals didn't account for this. Their doctrine assumed defenders would use rifles and machine guns, weapons that killed linearly, 1 bullet at a time. The casualty calculations factored in losing 30–40% of the attacking force before reaching enemy positions. That was acceptable math if the remaining 60% made it through. But shotguns with slam fire created localized kill zones that were absolute. Not 30% casualties across the formation, but everything in front of this position ceases to exist for 3 seconds, then again, then again. The reload was the weapon's weakness. 6 seconds to thumb 5 shells back into the tube magazine. In those 6 seconds, a running man could cover 450 yards. But Marine doctrine adapted quickly. Shotgunners worked in pairs, or were positioned between rifle-armed Marines who'd cover during the reload, and 6 seconds was still faster than a bolt-action reload, comparable to a Garand reload. The difference was what happened before the reload: 54 projectiles versus 5 or 8 bullets. Range was another limitation. Beyond 40 yards, buckshot spread too wide to be reliably lethal. The pellets lacked the mass to stay effective at distance, but that was exactly the range where Banzai charges were most vulnerable. The tactic relied on closing from 50 yards to contact as fast as possible. The trench gun turned those 50 yards into a kill zone measured in seconds. By the time the charge reached 40 yards, the shotguns opened up. If any attackers made it through the shotgun fire to 20 yards, they were running into rifle and BAR fire from fresh shooters who hadn't been firing continuously. The Marines started calling it layered defense. Rifles engaged at 100+ yards, thinning the charge. Bars hammered the formation at 50 yards. Shotguns annihilated the survivors at 20 yards. And if anything made it through, there were pistols, knives, and entrenching tools. But with shotguns in the mix, the last step rarely happened. The charges broke before reaching the line, and broken charges became individual targets, manageable, no longer terrifying. The Army's doctrine assumed modern warfare was about precision and range. The Marines were learning that Pacific warfare was about volume and proximity. And for that specific problem, the weapon everyone called obsolete was proving to be exactly right. Guadalcanal could have been an anomaly, one battle where conditions favored the shotgun. But the Pacific campaign was just beginning, and every island brought new environments where the same brutal math repeated itself. The trench gun wasn't situationally effective. It was universally effective wherever the Japanese charged, and they kept charging. Tarawa Atoll, November 1943. This wasn't a jungle. It was a flat coral reef with a tiny island, Betio, barely 300 acres and fortified like a concrete bunker. The Marines expected the defenses, but not the tactic. Japanese commander Keiji Shibasaki had 4,500 troops in reinforced positions, and his plan was to let the Marines land, then counterattack at night when American naval gunfire couldn't support them. November 20th, after a brutal day of fighting, the Japanese launched nighttime Banzai charges against the Marine perimeter. The terrain was nightmarish for defenders. Completely flat, no cover, and the only defensive positions were hastily scraped shallow holes in the coral. The Japanese came in waves, using wrecked landing craft and debris for concealment until the final rush. Marines with rifles fired until barrels glowed red-hot. But it was the shotgunners who broke the charges. On an open atoll where you could see the mass coming, the trench guns created visible gaps in the formation. Spaces where there had been men, and now there was just coral and bodies. One sergeant, John Basilone, later Medal of Honor recipient, wasn't carrying a trench gun himself, but witnessed their effect. His after-action report noted, "The Japs came in a pack, tight together. Rifle fire kills one at a time. Shotguns killed them in bunches. You could see the whole front rank go down like something swept them off their feet." Tarawa was a bloodbath for both sides. Over 1,000 Marines killed. But every Banzai charge failed. Not one broke through to overrun a position where shotguns were present. Saipan, June 1944. The island was larger, more strategic, and more heavily defended. The Japanese had 30,000 troops and a civilian population that had been told the Americans would torture and murder them. The fighting was savage. On July 7th, the Japanese launched one of the largest Banzai charges of the war. 3,000 troops and armed civilians in a massive suicide attack against the 27th Infantry Division and Marine positions near Tanapag. The charge was apocalyptic, wave after wave. Some troops armed only with bamboo spears or broken bottles tied to sticks. The sheer mass should have been overwhelming. American positions fired every weapon they had: artillery, mortars, machine guns, rifles. But the charge kept coming. Then the Marines with trench guns stepped up. They fired until their hands blistered from the heat of the barrel. They fired until they ran out of buckshot and started using slugs. They fired until the pump mechanisms jammed from overheating, then cleared them and kept firing. By dawn, over 4,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians were dead in front of American positions. U.S. casualties were heavy, over 400 killed. But the line held, and in the after-action analysis, a pattern was emerging. Units with shotgun-equipped personnel had lower casualties and more successful defensive stands than units without. The statistics were becoming undeniable. Peleliu, September 1944. This island was supposed to fall in 4 days. It took 2 months. The Japanese had abandoned Banzai charges in favor of fortified cave systems and defense in depth. They'd learned that massed charges didn't work against Marine firepower. But on September 24th, Japanese commanders ordered a final nighttime Banzai attack against the 5th Marines. Old doctrine, desperation move. It failed spectacularly. The Marines had learned to position shotgunners at expected attack routes, the obvious approaches, the paths of least resistance. When the Japanese came, they ran into what one Marine called a wall of buckshot. The charge collapsed in under 2 minutes. Over 200 Japanese soldiers died. Marine casualties, 15 wounded, none killed. It wasn't even close. The pattern held across the island campaigns: Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima. Wherever the Japanese attempted Banzai charges, the presence of shotguns dramatically increased defensive success and decreased Marine casualties. By late 1944, the official Marine Corps doctrine had been quietly updated. FM 2175, infantry scouting, patrolling, and sniping, now included a section on special weapons for jungle and close terrain that specifically recommended shotguns for defense against massed assault. The Army was slower to adapt. The European theater had no equivalent of the Banzai charge. German infantry used fire and maneuver, not massed shock tactics. So the Army's experience didn't validate shotguns the way the Pacific did. But by 1945, even Army units preparing for the invasion of Japan were requesting trench guns. The reports from the Pacific were too consistent to ignore. When the enemy charged, shotguns saved lives. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was proven fact, written in the failed Banzai charges across a dozen islands. By early 1945, the Army had a problem. The after-action reports from the Pacific kept contradicting established doctrine. The M1 Garand was supposed to be the superior weapon in all infantry scenarios. But Marine units equipped with Winchester 1897 shotguns were consistently outperforming rifle-only units in defensive operations against Japanese attacks. The Army Ordnance Department could ignore anecdotal evidence, but they couldn't ignore statistical patterns across 2 years and dozens of engagements. The data was damning. Marine rifle companies with organic shotgun sections reported 40–60% fewer casualties during nighttime defensive actions compared to companies without shotguns. Japanese Banzai charges against shotgun-equipped positions had a 95% failure rate, meaning only 5% achieved any penetration of defensive lines. And those were usually positions where the shotgunners had been specifically targeted first, or had run out of ammunition. The math was clear. Shotguns worked. But doctrine doesn't change easily. The Army's counter-argument was that the Pacific Theater was a special case. Dense terrain, unique enemy tactics, unusual circumstances. The real war was in Europe, where engagement ranges were longer, enemy tactics more sophisticated, and modern rifles clearly superior. There was an unspoken element, too: institutional pride. The Army had spent a decade championing the M1 Garand as the pinnacle of infantry weapons. Admitting a 45-year-old shotgun was more effective in certain situations felt like admitting failure. Then came the Philippines campaign, and the Army couldn't ignore it anymore. In February 1945, during the Battle of Manila, Japanese Marines and naval troops, trapped in the city, launched desperate Banzai charges against U.S. Army positions. The 37th Infantry Division, pure Army, no Marines, faced multiple night attacks. Units equipped with shotguns, from earlier jungle warfare requisitions, successfully repelled charges with minimal casualties. Units without shotguns suffered heavily, with some positions overrun entirely. The 37th's after-action report was clinical. Shotgun-armed personnel demonstrated effectiveness significantly exceeding rifle-armed personnel in close-quarters defensive situations. Recommend immediate increased allocation to units facing close assault tactics. It was nearly identical to what the Marines had been saying for 2 years, but now it was coming from Army units, Army officers, in an Army report. The Ordnance Department authorized limited procurement, not a full endorsement, just supplemental weapons for specific tactical situations. The language was careful, preserving the M1's primacy, while acknowledging that maybe, in certain rare circumstances, the old trench gun had value. Winchester received contracts to resume production. Existing stocks were pulled from warehouses and shipped west. By spring 1945, shotguns were being issued to Army units preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The invasion planning revealed just how much attitudes had shifted. Intelligence estimates predicted the Japanese would use massed Banzai charges as a primary defensive tactic on the home islands. Cultural analysis suggested Japanese civilians might participate in suicide attacks. The planners were looking at Saipan's civilian Banzai charge multiplied by 1,000. Every planning document for the invasion included provisions for shotgun ammunition measured in millions of shells. Staff officers who'd been skeptical a year earlier were now requesting enough trench guns to equip one man in every 4-man fire team. The proposed assault loads for invasion troops included bandoliers of buckshot as standard issue. Defensive doctrine for beachhead positions put shotgunners at 10-yard intervals along the perimeter. The weapon that had been obsolete in 1941 was now central to planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. The shift wasn't just tactical, it was cultural. The Army had built its identity around technological superiority and modern doctrine. Acknowledging the shotgun's effectiveness meant acknowledging that sometimes the old ways, the brutal ways, the unsophisticated ways, were the right ways. It meant admitting that the Marines, the smaller service that the Army often looked down on, had been right about something fundamental. There was a personal element, too. Army officers who'd criticized the Marines' reliance on WWI relics were now requesting those same relics for their own troops. Marine veterans took grim satisfaction in the reversal. One Marine gunnery sergeant, asked about the Army's sudden interest in shotguns, said, "Took 'em long enough. We've been telling them since Guadalcanal. But I guess some lessons you gotta learn the hard way." The atomic bombs in August 1945 made Operation Downfall unnecessary. So the planned mass employment of shotguns in the invasion never happened. But the doctrinal shift was permanent. By the time the war ended, the U.S. military had gone from viewing shotguns as obsolete relics to recognizing them as essential close-quarters combat weapons. The post-war infantry manuals would reflect that change, and every subsequent conflict would include shotguns in the American arsenal. Okinawa was going to be the rehearsal for invading Japan itself, the ultimate test of American doctrine against Japanese desperation. The island was 70 miles long, heavily populated, and defended by 100,000 Japanese troops who knew this was the last barrier before the home islands. The invasion began April 1, 1945, and immediately became the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. The Japanese had learned. After years of failed Banzai charges, they'd shifted to defense in depth, fortified caves, interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-registered on likely American positions. But old habits die hard, and the cultural imperative of the offensive was baked into Japanese military identity. By late May, with their defensive lines collapsing and American forces grinding toward the southern tip of the island, Japanese commanders reverted to what they knew: the attack. May 24, 1945. The Japanese launched a coordinated counterattack against the 1st Marine Division positions near Shuri Castle. It wasn't a single Banzai charge. It was multiple simultaneous assaults across a 3-mile front, supported by artillery and mortar fire. The Japanese committed over 5,000 troops, including their last reserve units. The goal was to break the American encirclement and restore the defensive line. It was the largest organized Japanese assault since Saipan. The Marines were ready. After 3 years of Pacific fighting, defensive doctrine had been refined to a science. Positions were mutually supporting, fields of fire were cleared and pre-registered, ammunition was stockpiled deep, and every rifle squad had at least one shotgunner, positioned to cover the most likely approach routes. Some companies had pushed it further, 2 or 3 shotguns per squad, with dedicated ammo bearers carrying nothing but buckshot shells. The attack came at dusk, that dangerous twilight period when visibility drops, but night vision hasn't adapted. The Japanese used the terrain, gullies, brush, bomb craters, to close within 50 yards before the final rush. Then they came screaming out of the half-light, bayonets fixed in the old style. Hundreds of men in a compact mass, moving fast, counting on shock and momentum. Marine rifle fire erupted first. M1s and BARs pouring lead into the formation. The front ranks staggered, but kept coming. 40 yards, 30 yards. Then the shotguns opened up. The effect was immediate and devastating. At that range, with that target density, missing was impossible. Every pump sent 9 pellets into the mass. The Japanese formation didn't just slow, it came apart. But this time was different. The Japanese had committed so many troops that even catastrophic casualties in the front ranks didn't stop the attack. The men behind kept coming, stepping over bodies, driven by orders and desperation. Some positions faced not one wave, but 3 or 4. Successive charges that kept coming even as the previous one was destroyed. The shotgunners fired until their hands bled from the pump's recoil and heat. They fired until their ammunition bearers ran dry and had to scavenge shells from the dead. They fired until the barrels glowed and the mechanisms started to fail from heat stress. And then they dropped the shotguns and picked up rifles, pistols, anything that would shoot. Several positions were overrun, not because the shotguns failed, but because the sheer numbers overwhelmed the mathematical equation. When 200 men charge and you kill 190, the last 10 can still kill you. But across the 3-mile front, the pattern held. The Japanese attack broke against Marine defensive fire. By dawn, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Marine casualties were heavy, almost 400 killed. But the line held. The counterattack had failed. In the after-action analysis, a clear pattern emerged. Positions equipped with multiple shotguns suffered 60% fewer casualties than rifle-only positions. The Japanese had adapted their tactics, but the fundamental math hadn't changed. Shotguns delivered close-range firepower that rifles couldn't match. One company commander noted, "They came at us with everything they had. If we hadn't had the shotguns, they'd have broken through." It's that simple. Okinawa was the last time Japanese forces launched large-scale Banzai charges in WWII. The campaign ended in late June with over 100,000 Japanese military dead and an American force bloodied but victorious. The projected casualties for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, were based largely on Okinawa's ratios. And in every planning document, shotguns featured prominently in the defensive loadouts. The battle proved something the Marines had known since Guadalcanal. When the enemy comes at close range in mass, the weapon that puts the most projectiles downrange, the fastest wins. The Winchester 1897, designed in the 19th century for hunting and trench fighting, had become the definitive counter to one of WWII's most terrifying tactics. It wasn't elegant or sophisticated, it was just brutally mathematically effective. And when the atomic bombs fell in August, ending the war, the shotgun was firmly established as an essential weapon in the American arsenal. No longer obsolete but proven. When the war ended in August 1945, the U.S. military faced the task of codifying the lessons learned in 4 years of global combat. The weapons, tactics, and doctrines that had worked would be preserved and institutionalized. Those that had failed would be discarded. The shotgun, which had entered the war as a forgotten relic, emerged as validated doctrine. The post-war infantry manuals told the story. The 1940 edition of FM 2310 mentioned shotguns in a single paragraph, classifying them as limited utility for guard and police functions. The 1949 revision included an entire chapter on combat shotguns, with detailed sections on employment, ammunition selection, and tactical integration into rifle squads. The language was precise and unambiguous. In close quarters, defensive situations against massed assault, the combat shotgun provides firepower superior to individual or automatic rifles. The change wasn't just acknowledgement, it was institutional. The Army and Marines established permanent shotgun training programs. Combat shotgun courses became part of infantry school. Procurement shifted from emergency requisitions to standardized supply chains. And crucially, the military started developing modern combat shotguns specifically for warfare, not just adapting civilian hunting weapons. The Winchester Model 12, a more refined pump-action design, entered military service in large numbers. It lacked the slam-fire feature of the 1897, that was seen as too dangerous for peacetime training, but could still deliver 6 rounds in under 4 seconds with proper technique. Later, the Remington 870 and Mossberg 500 series would become standard issue, refined specifically for military requirements. But all of them traced their tactical lineage back to the 1897 trench gun and those desperate nights in the Pacific. The doctrine spread internationally. Allied nations that had fought in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, adopted combat shotguns into their infantry formations. The lessons were too clear to ignore. When fighting an enemy willing to close to hand range, shotguns saved lives. Even nations that hadn't faced Banzai charges recognized the value for urban combat, trench fighting, and close-quarters battle. Ironically, the shotgun's success created a new controversy. The 1918 German protest about shotguns being inhumane echoed through the decades. In the 1950s and 60s, some international arms control discussions questioned whether shotguns violated the spirit of the Hague Conventions, prohibiting weapons that caused unnecessary suffering. The U.S. position was blunt. If the enemy chooses to close to bayonet range, we'll use the most effective weapon for that range. The shotgun stayed. The Korean War validated the doctrine again. Chinese and North Korean forces used human wave attacks similar to Banzai charges, mass, speed, and shock to overwhelm defensive positions. American troops with shotguns broke those charges the same way the Marines had broken Japanese attacks. Vietnam saw extensive shotgun use in jungle fighting and tunnel clearance. Every subsequent conflict, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, included combat shotguns in the American arsenal. 1897 itself became a legend. Though officially replaced by more modern weapons, Winchester 1897s remained in military inventory into the 1960s. Some units kept them specifically for their psychological impact and historical connection. Today, they're museum pieces and collector's items, but their tactical legacy lives on in every modern combat shotgun. The deeper legacy is doctrinal. The Pacific War taught the U.S. military that doctrine must adapt to reality, not the other way around. The modern warfare theories of the 1930s had assumed combat would follow certain patterns: medium range, dispersed formations, technological superiority. The Pacific taught that the enemy gets a vote. When the enemy chooses tactics that negate your advantages, you need weapons and doctrine that answer those tactics. The shotgun's resurrection from obsolescence to essential weapon became a case study in military flexibility. It demonstrated that old doesn't always mean outdated, and that sometimes the right weapon for the job is the one that actually works, regardless of what the manuals say. That lesson, pragmatism over doctrine, effectiveness over elegance, became embedded in American military culture. There's a final note in the official Marine Corps' history of the Pacific War. The Model 1897 trench gun, dismissed as obsolete in 1941, proved more effective against massed infantry assault than any weapon developed during the war. Its success was not a failure of modern design, but a reminder that the right tool depends entirely on the task. When the task was stopping Banzai charges, nothing worked better. The Marines who carried those shotguns through the islands knew it more simply. When the enemy came screaming out of the darkness, when there was no time to think and barely time to react, you held the trigger down and pumped. 6 shots, 3 seconds, again and again until they stopped coming. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. Every time. And in combat, that's the only metric that matters. The legacy endures. Every shotgun in military service today, every breaching gun, every close-quarters weapon, every last-resort defensive tool, traces back to those desperate Pacific nights when obsolete became essential, and a 45-year-old design saved the lives of the men who trusted it. The doctrine changed because the weapon worked. And it worked because someone had the sense to question whether modern always meant better. Sometimes the old ways are the right ways. Sometimes the weapon everyone discarded is exactly what you need. The Marines learned it in the jungle. The Army learned it the hard way. And the lesson stuck. When doctrine meets reality, and they contradict each other, believe reality.